Welcome to Restoria. I'm Edward, and this is your quiet place for gentle bedtime stories. Get comfortable, take a breath, and let the story ease you into sleep. The night round. The torch at the end of the corridor had burned low, not dangerously so, just low enough that the flame no longer threw shadows against the far wall, only a soft amber smear that moved with the draft, like something breathing. Aldrin noticed it on his way past. He would see to it before the hour turned. He walked slowly. There was no reason to walk any other way. The east wing of the castle had been quiet since supper, and the night had settled into itself the way nights did here in the deep months of winter, heavy and still and full of small sounds that only emerged when the louder ones had gone. The creak of timber somewhere in the upper rafters, the low moan of wind finding a gap in the stonework somewhere high above, the steady drip of water from the cistern in the lower passage, which had been dripping since long before Aldrin's time and would likely go on dripping long after. He was a tall man, not broad, and he moved through the castle's corridors with the particular ease of someone who had walked them so many times that his feet had learned the way without him. 32 years. That was how long he had served within these walls. He had come as a young man of 19, a little frightened of the scale of things, the height of the gates, the cold look of the stone in winter morning light. Now the stone felt like something else entirely. It felt like company. His boots were soft-soled, worn smooth at the heel. They made almost no sound on the flagstones. This had always pleased him. The castle at night belonged to its own kind of quiet, and he had always felt that a night guard who clattered and announced himself was missing the point of the thing entirely. The corridors were not obstacles to cross. They were the work itself. He passed the door to the great hall. The fire inside had been banked for the night, and through the gap at the bottom of the door came a faint warmth and the smell of wood smoke and tallow and the remnants of the evening meal. Roasted meat and something sweeter beneath it. Herb bread, perhaps. The kitchen women had been baking since mid-afternoon. He had passed by the kitchen door on his first round and paused there longer than he needed to, letting the warm air settle around him before moving on. The smell of wood smoke followed him a little way down the corridor. Then the stone took over again, cool and faintly mineral, the smell of old walls and older air. There was a particular quality to the air in this corridor that he had noticed long ago and never quite stopped noticing. It was the smell of continuity, he supposed, though he would never have put it in those words to anyone. The smell of a place that had stood through many seasons without fundamental change. Each winter the same cold pressed in from outside. Each summer the same warmth rose from the courtyard stones below, and in between the stone held whatever temperature it pleased. At the turn of the corridor stood a narrow window, no wider than a man's shoulders, cut deep into the wall. Aldrin stopped there as he always did. The courtyard below was empty at this hour, the cobblestones slick with the frost that had come in just after sundown. A single torch burned in its iron bracket near the stable door. Its flame moved in the wind, steadied, moved again. The sky above the battlements was clear tonight, thick with stars, more than the eye could properly take in. They always looked closer in winter, colder and closer, like small fires burning a very long way off. He stood at the window for a while, long enough to feel the cold of the stone through the wool of his sleeve where his arm rested against the sill, long enough for his breath to mist faintly in the air before him, rising and dispersing in the draft that came through the gap at the window's edge. The courtyard below was so still that he could hear very faintly the sound of the stable horses settling in their stalls. A low breath, the soft shift of weight on straw. Animals that slept without worry in the cold, simply warm within their own bodies. Then he moved on. The north corridor was the longest in the castle, running the full length of the east wing from the guard room at one end to the chapel at the other. Aldrin had walked it so many times he could count the flagstones in his sleep. 47 from the guard room door to the place where the floor dipped slightly, worn by centuries of passing feet. Another 23 from there to the chapel threshold. He had counted them once, in his early years, and the number had never left him, though he could not have said why he'd bothered in the first place. Perhaps because it was the kind of thing a 19-year-old did when given a long corridor and too much quiet. Along the north wall hung a row of old tapestries. They had been there since before his time, depicting scenes of hunts and harvests, figures on horseback moving through forests that no longer existed anywhere beyond the wool. In daylight they were faded things, their colors dulled to rust and ochre and a tired kind of green. At night, in torchlight, they looked different. The figures seemed to move slightly, or the suggestion of movement was there, the torchlight shifting across the woven thread so that a horse's leg appeared to lift, a branch to sway. Aldrin had stopped being unsettled by this years ago. Now he found it pleasant, a little company on the long walk. He paused in front of the largest tapestry, the one depicting a feast in a great outdoor pavilion, figures seated around long tables beneath a canopy of woven leaves. A woman at the center of the scene had always caught his attention, not because she was particularly prominent, but because of the way the weaver had rendered her expression. Not quite smiling, not quite elsewhere. Something in between, a look of comfortable distance, as though the feast was happening around her and she was content to let it. He understood that look. He had come to something like that look himself over the years. The tapestry beside it showed a different scene entirely. A harvest, figures in a field, their postures bent and working, sheaves of grain stacked along the edges of the frame. There was a dog in the lower corner, barely visible, its head turned towards something outside the frame. He had only noticed the dog perhaps 5 or 6 years ago, despite having walked past this tapestry for decades. It struck him as the kind of detail a weaver might put in just for themselves, a small private pleasure hidden in plain sight. He appreciated that, the pleasure of finding something that had been waiting. The third tapestry was narrower than the others, tucked between 2 stone pillars in a way that left it slightly in shadow even in good torchlight. It depicted a river, or what might have been a river, a long pale band moving through dark landscape toward a horizon of gray hills. No figures in this one, just the river and the hills and a sky rendered in wool of such a soft and faded blue that it seemed less like color than like light. Aldrin had always found this tapestry harder to look at than the others, not for any unpleasant reason, simply because it felt unfinished somehow, as though the weaver had left the human element out deliberately, had trusted the landscape to be enough. He was not entirely sure the weaver had been wrong. Further along, a door stood slightly ajar. The chamber of the steward's assistant, a young man named Rowan who had arrived in the autumn and was still adjusting to castle life. Through the gap came the quiet sound of breathing, steady and deep. The boy slept well, at least. Aldrin pulled the door closed with the gentlest pressure, just enough to release the latch without sound, and moved on. He had a fondness for the young ones when they first arrived. They always came in looking at the walls with wide eyes, trying to take in the scale of the place. The towers, the courtyards, the weight of the stone overhead. It could overwhelm a person, the sheer age of it. So much had happened within these walls, so many seasons had turned, so many people had passed through and moved on, and still the castle stood and the corridors remained and the torches burned each night as they always had. There was something in that continuity that Aldrin had learned over many years to find deeply restful. He remembered his own first weeks, the way the stone had felt cold and impersonal, the way the scale of the building had made him feel briefly irrelevant. He had been given the night watch early, which was unusual, and he had spent those first rounds in a state of careful alertness, cataloging everything, trying to learn the building before it became routine. Now the building was as known to him as his own hands. Every corridor and stairway and doorway stored somewhere below conscious thought. That transition from unfamiliar to intimate was one he had watched others make many times since. It always took about one winter. The cold seemed to help, somehow. It pressed people inward, made them pay attention to warmth and shelter in a way the mild seasons did not. The chapel at the end of the corridor was never fully locked at night. The latch could be lifted from either side, and Aldrin lifted it now, stepping through into the dim interior. A single candle burned on the altar at all times, a thick pillar of beeswax that was replaced each morning by the young novice who maintained the space. It was the only light in the room, and it was enough. The chapel was small by any grand measure. 4 rows of wooden pews on either side of a narrow aisle. Stone walls hung with nothing more than a simple wooden cross, and 2 small icons whose painted faces had gone soft with age. The floor was stone, as everywhere, but covered here by a long woven runner in deep red that had been worn pale in the center by many years of footsteps. The ceiling was low, and the candle's light reached it easily, casting the vaulted arches in amber. Aldrin sat down in the last pew, not to pray particularly. He was not a man of especially strong devotion, though he respected the space and what it meant to others. He sat because it was the one place in the castle where sitting felt entirely right at this hour, the one room designed for stillness, and stillness was what the body asked for at the midpoint of a long night. The candle flame held steady. There was less draft in here than in the corridors, the walls thicker, the single window barely a slit in the stone. The flame barely moved at all. It burned with a quiet steadiness that was almost meditative, the light it cast warm and unchanging. The smell of beeswax was gentle and clean, faintly sweet, mixed with the faint residue of incense from the morning's observances, a dry and woody note that clung to the stone walls the way old smells do in enclosed spaces. He sat for a while. The pew was hard beneath him, as pews always were, but he had sat in this one so many times that he had learned to settle into it properly, letting his weight distribute, finding the position where the hardness became merely a surface and not a complaint. Outside the chapel, somewhere in the upper reaches of the east tower, an owl called once and went quiet. The wind moved against the walls of the castle, found nothing to grip, moved on. Inside, only the candle and the settled air and the faint warmth of the wooden pew at his back. He thought, as he sometimes did in this room, of the people who had sat here before him. Not any specific people, just the general weight of them. The guards and servants and travelers who had sat in exactly this pew at exactly this hour across many generations, some of them frightened, some of them peaceful, some of them simply tired and glad of somewhere quiet to sit for a moment. The wood of the pew had absorbed something of all of them, or so it felt. A quality of having been sat in many times, a kind of worn welcome. like a stone step that has been touched so often it has grown smooth, not diminished, made more itself. When he stood again, his knees reminded him briefly of his years, not painfully, just an acknowledgement. He paused at the chapel door, looked back once at the candle, and stepped out into the corridor. The second half of his round took him through the lower passage, which ran beneath the great hall and connected the east wing to the kitchen block and the storerooms. It was cooler down here, the air carrying the particular dampness of underground spaces, even though the passage was not properly underground, only sunk below the level of the main courtyard. The walls here were rougher than above, the stonework older and less finished, and in places the mortar had crumbled away to reveal the raw faces of the stones beneath. Aldrin's torch threw long shadows in the low passage. His own shadow moved ahead of him, stretched tall against the ceiling, the way it always did in confined spaces with a light source behind. The passage smelled differently to the rest of the castle. Less wood smoke, more earth. The smell of the stone itself, which was different here than above, darker and denser, a stone quarried from deeper in the hillside. The builders of the lower sections had used whatever was nearest, and what was nearest had been this stone, heavy and gray-green, cut roughly and stacked with more pragmatism than craft. Aldrin had always appreciated the lower passage for exactly that reason. There was an honesty to it. No tapestries here, no pretense. Just the plain necessity of the building making itself known. The cistern was there in its alcove as always. Drip. Pause. Drip. He had long since stopped hearing it as anything other than a kind of clock. The castle's oldest clock, the one that never stopped and never needed winding. In summer the dripping was faster, swollen by whatever water found its way through the hillside above. In winter it slowed to this, measured and deliberate. He had come to associate the pace of the drip with the season in a way that felt more immediate than any calendar. He paused beside the cistern for a moment, holding his torch away so it did not disturb the surface of the water. The basin was carved from a single piece of stone, very old, its edges worn smooth. The water inside was perfectly still between drops, dark and reflective, holding a warped image of the torch flame on its surface. Then a drop fell, and the image shattered into a dozen wavering pieces, and then slowly gathered itself back. Beyond the cistern, the passage widened into the antechamber of the storeroom. The storeroom door was bolted. He checked it by touch rather than sight, running his fingers across the bolt and finding it fully drawn. This too was habit, the check so familiar it barely registered as an action. In 32 years he had never found the bolt undone at this hour. He expected he never would. But the check was the point. The doing of it. the presence, the assurance that someone had been here and found things as they should be. The kitchen block beyond was warm even at this hour. The great bread ovens held their heat long into the night, and the residual warmth of an afternoon's baking still lived in the walls and the low ceiling. Aldrin stood in the doorway for a moment, not entering, just letting the warmth come to him. It was the kind of warmth that settled on the shoulders, that made the body want to be still. A dry and enveloping warmth, very different from the warmth of an open fire. The warmth of stored heat, patient and steady, given off slowly through the night. The kitchen was entirely empty. The long tables wiped clean, the pots and pans stacked on their hooks, the cutting board stowed against the far wall. A cloth hung over a covered dish on the table nearest the window. He did not investigate it. It was not his to investigate. But the smell around it was good. Warm pastry and something fruited beneath. Someone had been thoughtful enough to set it aside. The silence in the kitchen had a different quality to the silence elsewhere in the castle. Fuller, somehow, as though all the activity of the day had left a residue that still faintly occupied the space. The cutting and stirring and the voices of the women who worked here, all of it gone now, but the space not entirely empty of them. Kitchens held warmth longer than other rooms, in more ways than one. He let the warmth hold him for a little longer than usual. There was a wooden stool just inside the kitchen doorway, set there so the night watch could sit if they needed to. He did not often use it, but tonight the warmth of the kitchen was particularly good, and his feet had covered a great deal of stone. He sat on the stool with his back against the doorframe, half in the kitchen and half in the passage, the warmth of the ovens reaching him from the right, and the cooler air of the lower passage at his left shoulder. A strange kind of position, inhabiting two temperatures at once, but not uncomfortable. In fact, after a moment, quite comfortable. He sat there for a while in the way he sometimes sat in the chapel, not for any particular reason, simply because stopping felt right. The kitchen around him was as still as anything in the castle, stiller perhaps, because kitchens in the working hours were never still, always in motion, always producing some sound or smell, and the contrast between that state and this one was particularly pronounced. Now the room was simply a room. The tables and the hooks and the stacked pots all returned to their plain selves. Objects at rest, waiting without urgency for morning. He rose eventually, slower than he had sat, and turned back into the passage and made his way toward the stairs. The upper floors were quieter still. The sleeping chambers lined the south-facing corridor, their doors closed, the sounds from within reduced to almost nothing. From one room came the faint sound of snoring, low and rhythmic, the sound of someone deeply under. From another, nothing at all. From a third, the creak of a bed frame shifting as someone turned in their sleep, and then stillness again. Each door told its own kind of story in the sounds it let through and the sounds it held back. Aldrin moved down the corridor with particular care here. His soft boots made almost no sound, but still he placed each foot with intention, choosing the stones that he knew would not complain. There was a particular flag near the third door from the end that had a hollow sound to it, a faint ring if you caught it wrong. He had learned to step over it years ago. Now he did so without thinking, the way a person learns to avoid a low beam in a familiar ceiling, the body knowing before the mind. The corridor had a particular smell at this hour, something between the wood smoke that drifted up from the great hall below and the faintly human warmth of occupied rooms. Not unpleasant, the smell of a building in use, of rooms that were lived in and slept in and breathed in. It reminded him, on nights when he was in a certain kind of mood, of what the whole building was ultimately for. Not the battlements or the great hall or the ceremonies and protocols that filled the daylight hours. Just this. People sleeping inside walls that held. At the end of the corridor was the window he liked best, wider than the one in the east wing, and positioned so that in winter it faced not the courtyard but the open land beyond the walls. Fields and then forest and then, on a clear night, the line of hills against the sky. Tonight the fields were white with frost, the moonlight turning them to something pale and still and very flat. The forest beyond was a dark mass, present and unhurried, full of its own life, its own quiet business. The hills were barely visible, a suggestion at the edge of the sky, darker than the dark around them. He stood at the window for longer than he had stood at the other. The cold came through the glass, the panes thin and slightly warped, casting the moonlight into gentle distortions. His breath fogged the glass slightly when he leaned close. Beyond the frost-pale fields, nothing moved. The whole landscape was held in the particular stillness of a cold, clear night, everything touched with frost and moonlight, everything resting. There was a quality to midwinter nights that Aldrin had never quite found words for, though he had lived through enough of them. Something in the stillness that felt less like absence and more like fullness, as though the cold had gathered everything in close, as though the world had drawn its edges together and settled. He felt it now, looking out over the white fields, a sort of comprehensive quiet that pressed gently against the walls of the castle from all sides. Inside, the torches and the banked fires and the sleeping warmth of the people within. Outside, the frost and the stillness and the stars. The two conditions, inner and outer, so different and yet both so complete. He was the thread between the two. That was how he had come to understand his work. Not a wall, not a barrier, a thread. Someone moving quietly through the spaces between, keeping the connection intact, making sure the warmth inside was still warmth by the time morning came. He turned from the window. On his way back through the south corridor, he passed the small alcove where, in warmer months, the household cat liked to sleep on a folded blanket that someone had placed there years ago. In winter, the cat preferred the kitchen, and the blanket sat empty. Aldrin touched the edge of it as he passed. It was still faintly warm from the day, holding whatever heat had been in the corridor through the afternoon. Small things held warmth longer than you expected. At the far end of the south corridor was the guard room, where the second watch would be sitting. Aldrin pushed the door open quietly. Inside, Finn sat at the table with a cup of something warm between his hands and a look of total contentment on his face. He was a young man of perhaps 25, fair-haired, with an unhurried way of carrying himself that Aldrin had always thought well of. Not laziness, something more considered. The kind of young man who understood that not everything needed to be done at speed. Finn looked up. "All quiet? All quiet," Aldrin said. Finn nodded and looked back at his cup. It was the entirety of the exchange they needed. Aldrin poured himself a cup from the pot on the hook above the small brazier. The liquid inside was a herbed infusion of some kind, something the kitchen kept prepared for the night watches. It smelled of dried chamomile and something woodier beneath it. Warm going down and warming in the hands. He held the cup with both palms and felt the heat of it move through the clay and into his fingers, spreading up through the joints of his hands in a way that was deeply satisfying on a cold night. They sat for a while without speaking. The brazier gave off a modest heat, enough for a small room, and the room was small. The walls were hung with cloaks and equipment, familiar shapes in the low light. A pair of lanterns sat unlit on the shelf above the window, their glass sides clouded with age. From outside came no sound, the courtyard below as empty and still as it had been at the start of the round. After a while, Finn said, without particular inflection, "I saw the owl again. In the east tower." "I heard it," Aldrin said. Finn nodded. Nothing more was needed on the subject. The owl had been resident in the east tower for as long as either of them could recall, and its occasional presence on the night watch had come to feel like a kind of shared understanding between the bird and the men below, a mutual acknowledgement of the hour. The owl keeping its own watch, the guards keeping theirs. Aldrin finished his cup. The warmth of it had settled somewhere below his ribs, a gentle spreading thing. His limbs felt heavier than they had at the start of the round, not unpleasantly so. The heaviness of a body that had done its work and was ready, at the appropriate hour, to be still. He set the cup down, stood. "I'll take the outer wall before the hour." Finn raised his cup slightly in acknowledgement. The outer wall was the final part of the round, a walkway that ran along the top of the castle's south-facing battlements. In rough weather, it was the hardest part, exposed and cold and sometimes slick with ice. Tonight, with the air still and the sky clear, it was the most beautiful. Aldrin climbed the narrow stair that led up to the walkway. The stone steps worn concave in the center from centuries of the same feet making the same ascent. He had a theory that if you looked carefully enough at the depressions in the stone, you could read something of all the different footsteps that had made them. Not literally, of course, but in some general sense. The accumulated weight of many generations of night watches pressed into the stone one step at a time. He had added his own year after year until whatever impression he had made was indistinguishable from all the rest. At the top, the air met him differently than below. Colder but cleaner, the smell of the inner castle replaced by something open and mineral, and faintly of the frost itself. He pulled his cloak closer and stepped out onto the walkway. The view from up here never failed to do something to him, even after 32 years, even on a night like any other night in winter. The land stretched away in every direction, the fields and the forest and the hills, all of it pale and still beneath the stars. The village to the west was a cluster of dark rooftops and 2 or 3 faint lights, the last of the fires not yet banked. Beyond it, nothing but open country all the way to where the land became sky. The scale of it always made him aware of the smallness of the building beneath his feet, which was not a diminishing feeling, but rather the opposite. To be small within something large and still. There was a peace in that. He walked the length of the battlements slowly. His breath came in small, soft clouds that dissolved almost immediately. Beneath his boots, the stone was cold and slightly rough with frost, and each step required a little care, a little deliberateness. He did not mind. Deliberateness suited the hour. It suited this place that demanded attention to each placement of the foot that did not permit mindlessness. Halfway along the walkway, he paused at the place where a stone had been repaired some years ago, set in by the mason's apprentice, and slightly lighter in color than the stones around it. It was barely visible now, the new stone beginning to weather to match the old. In another generation, it would be indistinguishable. The castle absorbed everything eventually, the repairs and the replacements and the additions, all of it becoming in time simply the castle, undifferentiated. He found that thought comfortable rather than melancholy. At the midpoint of the walkway, he stopped, looked out. The stars were extraordinary tonight, more than he had seen in weeks. The cold had cleared whatever had been misting them, and now they were simply there, immense and burning their ancient burning, entirely unconcerned with the small stone building below or the man standing on its wall. He did not find this diminishing. He never had. There was something in the sheer scale of it that pressed everything else into its proper proportion. The frost-white fields, the sleeping village, the dark forest standing at its edge, the hills beyond, barely there, and above it all, the stars. He stood with all of it around him and felt, as he felt on the best nights up here, that he was not separate from any of it. The same cold air that lay across the fields lay across his shoulders. The same frost that whitened the cobblestones below touched the stone beneath his feet. He was part of the night's texture, another quiet thing in a quiet landscape. He stood for a long time, long enough that the cold had found its way through his cloak and settled against his shoulders. Long enough that when he finally moved again, his body felt the shift as a kind of return. He completed the rest of the walkway at his usual pace, checked the far tower, found it as it should be, and descended back into the warmth of the castle below. The smell of wood smoke greeted him at the foot of the stair, and beneath it, still faintly, the memory of the evening's bread. The contrast between the cold of the outer wall and the warmth of the inner passage was always strongest in the first few moments of return, and he stood in it briefly before moving on. He made one final pass through the east wing before the end of his round. Past the tapestries with their torchlit figures, the woman with her comfortable distance, the dog in the corner of the harvest scene, the pale river on its way to the gray hills, past the closed door of the sleeping steward's assistant, past the window with its view of the frosty courtyard and the single torch still burning near the stable, past the door of the great hall, where the warmth still seeped through in a thin line of amber light at the base, the great fire reduced to coals but still alive, still giving. At the low burning torch he stopped and replaced it as he had intended at the start. He worked the old torch from its bracket, set the new one in, and held the flame of his own torch to it until it caught. A clean flame, clear and yellow, throwing its light properly against the stone. He stood back and looked at it for a moment. Then he moved on, everything in its place, everything still. He returned to the guardroom. Finn had gone to make his own round, leaving the room quiet and warm. The brazier ticked softly as the coals shifted beneath themselves. The cup from earlier was still on the table, empty, the clay still faintly warm to the touch. Aldrin settled into the chair by the brazier and let his shoulders drop. Outside, the wind moved against the castle walls and found nothing to trouble. The torch by the stable door burned on, steady in the still air. In the east tower, far above, the owl settled on its ledge and went quiet. The night was at its deepest now, the hour when the world felt most completely at rest, the hour when the darkness outside was the most thorough kind, not cold or ominous, simply full, complete, the kind of darkness that asked nothing of the people within, only that they sleep. Aldrin had learned, over many years, to love this hour. It was the hour that belonged to no one else, not to the day that had ended or the day that had not yet begun, just to the night itself, and to the people who moved quietly through it, making sure that everything held. He felt the weight in his legs, the familiar heaviness that came at the end of a long round, the body's way of registering all the corridors walked, all the stairs climbed, all the windows stood at. It was not fatigue so much as settledness, the body resting into itself after a night of careful attention. The brazier gave off its quiet warmth. The coals had reached that steady state where they no longer crackled or shifted but simply glowed, a deep and wordless orange, giving their heat evenly and without drama. The light they cast was low, amber, soft enough that the edges of the room went gently uncertain. The shelves and cloaks and lanterns half dissolved in the warm dimness. He had sat in this chair more times than he could count, on cold nights and mild ones, on nights of wind and rain, and on nights exactly like this one, when the world outside was perfectly still. The chair had shaped itself to him over the years, or he to it. Either way, it fit. The coals breathed their orange breath. Outside, a long silence. Then the drip of the cistern, distant in the lower passage. Steady, patient. The castle breathed around him. He could feel it the way you felt a large thing in the dark, not by seeing it, but by the weight of it, by the way it held the air. The stones that had stood for centuries, now holding the warmth of the fires within. The corridors empty and still, the rooms full of sleeping people, their breath rising and falling in the dark. The tapestries still, the chapel candle burning, the cistern dripping in the deep passage below. All of it held together, all of it quiet. Aldrin let his eyes rest on the glow of the brazier. The warmth was good. The chair was good. The small orange light was good. Beyond the guardroom window, the frost held its cold across the courtyard stones. The torch by the stable burned. The stars continued their ancient business far above the battlements. the drip in the passage below, the warmth in the walls, the coals lower now, slower, and somewhere in the east tower, above the tapestries and the long corridor and the chapel with its single candle, the owl tucked its head beneath its wing and was still. The castle breathed, slow, even, warm at the center, cold at the edges, held. The coals glowed. The night went on, and everything that was supposed to be there was there. Everything that was supposed to hold held. The warmth, the stone, the dark, the quiet, all of it. Still,